We have all been fed lies. We have been told that the Crusades were unjust, evil, immoral, particularly violent, vicious, unwarranted, that Christians just attacked poor innocent Muslims. This narrative could not be more false. The Crusades were not only justifiable, they were morally right. What exactly were the Crusades? They were a series of 8 or 9, depending on who you ask, wars between Christian Europe and Muslim Asia Minor, what we know today as the Middle East. They stretched over a 174-year period from the year 1096 AD to 1270 AD. Christian Europe launched a series of offensives across continents to remove Muslim influence first from Europe and contain the Muslim expansion therein, to eventually remove Muslims from the Holy Land. A little bit of background. Our conflict begins in the early 7th century. Islam begins vast and violent expansion under Muhammad's leadership. In the Battle of Badr, against polytheistic Meccans, Momo launches a massive attack. The Battle of Uhud was the empire striking back, that being the polytheists coming back at Momo. And Battle of the Trench could, I guess, be described as Return of the Pedo. Momo expels Jewish tribes from Medina. The Jews amass a coalition and attack. The attack is unsuccessful, and the tribe that allied with the coalition is later sought out and completely wiped out by Momo. At the Battle of Khaybar, Momo attacks heavily Jewish city, allegedly because they were about to attack him. However, Surah 48 makes that not the case, as Allah tells Muhammad that they will receive lots of booty, double entendre intended, and secure his prophethood. After Khaybar is decimated, Muhammad eats a meal prepared for him by a Jewish woman whose family he just killed. How do you think that went? At the Battle of Mecca, an ally of the Muslims is attacked by allies of the Meccans. So Momo says the truce is broken and conquers Mecca in a very quiet battle. Muhammad had many other battles, both successful and unsuccessful, which led to Muslim expansion throughout the Levant, Mesopotamia, and southern Europe, which continued into the next century. There were 180 million Christians in the Roman Empire in 500 AD. Muslims begin conquest of Arabia in the late 6th century. Momo dies in 630. Then the Muslims conquer predominantly Christian and Jewish areas before pagan Mecca. You can kind of see clear patterns of conquering in the Quran, though it's not universal. Generally, it goes peace with non-believers. Non-believers are infidels, then conquer the non-believers. Meccan surahs are more peaceful because Momo didn't actually capture them. But, for example, Al-Bayna is the 100th surah, and it calls Christians, quote, the worst of all creatures, unquote. Rome's collapse in the 5th century opens the door for Islamic expansion in the next few centuries. Muslims push up into the Iberian Peninsula in 711 and captures it by 718. Islam has taken control of solidly Christian territory. Muslims continue fully into Christian Europe for the next 300 years. They also expand into the Christian Byzantine Empire. This was easier in part due to the Great Schism, which had disastrous effects on Christendom's defense against Islam. Western Christianity had been seizing the majority of power following Rome's fall. Eastern Christianity felt maligned and excluded from ecumenical councils and decisions. The Western Church did not consult the Eastern Church on adding the Filioque to the Nicene Creed, and that culminates in the Great Schism of 1054. Meanwhile, while all this was going on, and even before, the Muslims had begun expanding heavily into the Middle East. They had conquered Jerusalem early in 638 and quickly encroached into the Byzantine Empire afterward. Eastern Christianity refused to ask for help until it was too late, and Western Christianity refused to provide aid without being asked. Finally, the dam broke, and Islam pushed too close to home and approached France. This led to the Battle of Toulouse, which was a major decisive battle in modern-day France. The Dutch, led by of Aquitaine, and the Umayyad Muslims led by Al-Sam ibn Malik al-Kalani. Muslims laid siege to the city of Toulouse in 721. It was chosen as it was religiously and politically significant to Western Christian Europe. Udo did not appeal to the French for help, instead choosing to raise a local army of 300,000. The Muslim army, by contrast, was only 100,000. A large portion of the Christian army resided in a defensive formation in Toulouse. The Muslim siege began on June 9th. The battle ended on June 9th. Odo had pulled a little sneaky on the Umayyad Muslims and had the remaining portion of his army close in behind them from surrounding areas and absolutely crushed them. This was the first real pushback from Western Christianity against Muslim incursion. Following that was the Battle of Tours, which was the single most significant battle between Christians and Muslims before the Crusades. It was preceded by the crushing defeat of Odo at River Garonne after he allied himself with Muslim rebels. There is a famous quote in relation to the battle at the River Garonne, which says, "God alone knows the number of the slain." During the Battle of Tours, the size of the Umayyad Muslim army ranged from 60,000 to 80,000. They were led by Emir Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi Abd al-Rahman. Opposing them was anywhere from 15,000 to 75,000 Frankish Christians led by Charles Martel. The size and condition of the armies likely differed greatly. The Franks were unequipped, unarmored, outstrategized, and untrained. They used a phalanx-like formation, which hadn't been common practice in centuries. Muslims likely arrived on horseback. Now, for those who don't know, horses were the tanks of the medieval world. If you had a horse, you could probably take out tens upon tens of people. And while that may not sound like a lot, if you have 600 horses charging at the opposing army, it's gonna do a lot of damage. Horses were very, very important. The Muslims arranged said cavalry and infantry in a more grid-like square formation, which was actually quite avant-garde for the time and would remain in practice for almost 1,000 years. The Battle of Tours was indicative of how the American Revolution was fought and won. A far superior force in size, equipment, and training, getting outmatched because of territory, knowledge of the area, and battle conditions. The battle began with several small fights erupting over the course of 6 days, while Muslims waited for the fullness of the army to come. The Franks packed tightly together in the pseudo-phalanx formation, which was smart on two fronts. One, it insulated them from the cold, which the Arabs were not used to. The frigid October temperatures likely played a massive role in Tours. Had this been fought during summertime, the outcome would have likely been very different. Martel also had his army stay in heavily wooded areas on hills, which proved massively advantageous. That leads us to the second reason that it was smart to use the phalanx formation. Phalanx formations in woods, up hills, are excellent defenses against cavalry and archers. Horses cannot charge through lines when trees block necessary straight paths, nor can archers get clean shots through trees. Horses also cannot come down on top of infantry from downhill positions, and arrows do not fly uphill very well. The battle officially began on the 7th day. Muslims were unable to gain any significant progress due to the terrain. The cavalry was their main focus as it had won many battles for them up to this point, but it was wholly ineffective due to the woods and hills. The Muslims were soundly defeated in an opening attack, retreating to their camp. The total losses for the Christians were 1,500. The total losses for the Muslims were 25,000 and their commander al-Rahman. The Muslims were beaten so badly that they disappeared entirely. The Christian Franks prepared for an ambush counterattack, thinking that the Muslims were just regrouping, but sent out spies to see what was going on. The spies returned and informed Martel that the Muslims had actually run away with their proverbial tails between their legs. This was the turning point in Muslim expansion into Western civilization. This began the campaign to push the Muslims out of Western Europe entirely. Christian efforts to liberate Christians from Muslim-controlled Spain began. They were inspired by the victory at Tours, and as such, Western Christianity united in this effort. This was hugely successful. launching efforts in 722 that really began to pick up steam in the mid-8th century. The Reconquista, as it became known, would not be completed until 1492 when the Spanish defeated the Muslims at Granada, but this was still hugely important to begin now, as it symbolized the movement that was to come. With Islam running, the Eastern Byzantine Emperor Michael VII offers an olive branch to the Western Church in 1074. In exchange for military aid against Muslims in the East, the newly formed Eastern Orthodox Church will rejoin the Catholic Church. In 1095 AD, Pope Urban II joins Emperor Alexius Comnenus in announcing the First Crusade, a holy mission to retake the East from Muslims and once again have Christianity rule the Holy Land. So a brief summary of what we've talked about up to this point. As soon as Islam is founded, it spreads by the sword. The Middle East and Roman Empire were peacefully Christian long before Muslims had claim to them. Muslims continuously and aggressively expanded, violently and subjugatingly, into Christian territory. And the Christians primarily fought defensive battles attempting to preserve their own land. What exactly was it like for Christians under Muslim control? Well, let's talk about Muhammad's second favorite, jizya. Muslims and Christians are not equal citizens in Islamic rule. Christians must pay a special tax called jizya simply for not being a Muslim. The courts work differently for non-Muslims, i.e. harsher penalties upon rulings, less valid testimonies, so on and so on. You can be straight up murdered if you refuse to convert or pay. And of course, women are treated much more harshly under Sharia law than under Christian rule. So that brings us to the reasons for the First Crusade. And to say that the First Crusade started as a hot mess is like saying this year's Super Bowl could have put an insomniac to sleep, which is to say, it's obvious. Many non-sanctioned, less well-off knights and peasants were quick to respond. These troops were not organized or, as I mentioned, sanctioned by the church. They committed many war crimes and atrocities, such as killing German Jews en masse. Upon arriving to actual battle, this disheveled militia, known as the People's or Peasants' Crusade, was quickly and brutally dispatched by Turkish forces. Some do count this as a separate crusade all in itself. I tend to disagree because it was not an actually sanctioned crusade by the church. A more well-run army of commissioned knights leave for the capital of the Turkish military, Constantinople. The Battle of Constantinople is over before it begins. Christians overwhelmingly lay siege to it, sacking it with ease on June 19, 1097. The Christian army then pushes on to Antioch. The brutal Middle Eastern summer heat greatly slowed initial progress. Muslim counterattacks began at Delorium. Christians held their ground despite being caught in open terrain by archers. Once reinforcements had arrived, Christians successfully and majorly won. This battle was absolutely critical for morale because it was the first true test. It was brutal, it was awful, the fighting conditions were not fun, obviously, but the Christians were victorious. They looked at this as a victory against odds and as God's favor being with them. In the midst of the journey to Antioch, the Christian army began to dwindle from repeated attacks from better prepared, tactically superior Muslims. The Taurus Mountains were devastating in terms of loss, despite actually being victorious still. It took the entire summer to make it to the goal of Antioch. From October 20th, 1097 to June 3rd, 1098, the Christians sieged Antioch. Brutal and heavy losses to combat, disease, and starvation wreaked havoc on the Christians. Eventually, Bohemond, the Christian commander, made a deal with a Muslim commander inside Antioch, and Bohemond was raised over the walls and conquered Antioch from the inside. For this daring gesture, Bohemond insisted on keeping Antioch for himself, but Raymond, a fellow commander, argued it belonged to the Byzantines. This led to a heated disagreement that actually prevented the crusade from progressing for several months. You're going to notice that's a pattern that goes on. Eventually, Raymond moved on by himself with his army to Jerusalem, and Antioch remained solidly under Christian control. As Raymond and his army marched, many actually deserted en route to Jerusalem, choosing instead to return home. Finally, they reached and camped outside of Jerusalem on June 7th, 1099. The army stood about 1,500 cavalry and 12,000 soldiers versus the Fatimid Muslims. Jerusalem, funnily enough, was taken with barely any force. The siege took roughly 3 days, and the Muslims surrendered quickly. The Holy Land was Christian once more. Tancred, a Christian commander, gave his word that all in the Temple Mount would be spared. Unfortunately, his orders were swiftly disobeyed, and many Muslim and Jewish civilians were killed. After the siege was finished, most crusaders went home. Godfrey, Christian commander, assumed authority over Jerusalem, but died shortly after. His brother Baldwin took over as king of Jerusalem, defender of the Holy Sepulchre, which is a fire name. So what were the actual results of the First Crusade? Well, estimates from 1/3 to 2/3 of Crusader forces died. The size of the force was roughly 30,000 to 100,000, so at most 60,000 died in the campaign, mostly of disease and famine. Muslim casualties are estimated to be roughly the same. That would make the First Crusade not in the top 125 deadliest wars in history. In the aftermath, the Crusaders formed what's known as the Outremer Society, which comes from the French word meaning across the sea. They set up 4 Crusader kingdoms: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. The monks are introduced into the society to pacify warriors and ensure more Christian ethics. The First Crusade was a massive surprise to the overconfident Muslims. With the fall of the Turks, different power players began to emerge in the region. The Muslims regrouped and looked to take the whole of the Middle East under unified Islamic rule. Imad ad-Din Zaghi leads the Muslim efforts in 1144 and successfully captures Edessa on Christmas Eve. There is mass slaughter of Western Christians, and whoever was not slaughtered was most likely sold into slavery. The Western response to this atrocity was the Second Crusade. Pope Eugenius III calls for the crusade a following year, promising remission of sin, forgiveness of loans, and protection of families for those who served. 60,000 Christians, German King Conrad III, and King Louis VII of France lead the effort. This begins what is known as the King's Crusades. The mission was not expressly to take back Edessa, but to protect and preserve Christianity and important sites in the territory. This vague set of objectives led to a lot of confusion among the Crusaders of what exactly they were supposed to do. In September of 1146, the Latin ruler Jocelyn is defeated by Nur ed-Din, who is the successor to Zengi. Edessa is destroyed once again to celebrate Muslim victory. This time, Eastern Christians are not spared, as all male Christians are slaughtered and the women and children are sold into slavery. The reason for this is that the Crusader naval forces were delaying waiting for the land army to arrive, which was only making slow headway into the territory. Meanwhile, an official Iberian campaign begins with success, fully launching the Reconquista movement. While successful in northern Spain, southern Spain could not be taken at the time. The Baltic campaigns also begin, and quickly become a quagmire which continues throughout the remaining Crusades. Eastern and Western Christians clashed in power struggles, leading to actual minor military conflicts between the sides in Antioch and Byzantine-controlled areas. Byzantine Emperor Emmanuel I creates a truce with the Muslim Turks, which causes a major loss of support among Western Crusaders. The French Crusaders advocate for just straight-up taking Constantinople from the Byzantines. The German Crusaders could not help clear up the matter, as their Asia Minor forces were being quickly cut off by the Muslims. The Second Crusader force was coming apart at the seams. German forces ignore the Byzantine Emperor Manuel's advice and decide to move inland. The German Crusaders are thus vastly unprepared for the hot, dry climate of the Middle East and get annihilated by the Muslims at Doryleon on October 25th, 1147, forcing a retreat to Nicaea. The French are stunned by this defeat and quickly respond by defeating the Muslims using their cavalry, but are also in turn crushed at the Cadmul Mountains. The Crusader forces are divided up now and led by the Knights Templars. The French army reaches Antioch in the early 1148. Louis VII again ignores local advice and pushes south to Damascus. The siege of Damascus is disastrous for the Crusaders, lasting only 4 days, and it officially marks the end of the Second Crusade. The Second Crusade is honestly a complete disaster, which actually overshadowed the first even in that day. In total, relatively few Muslims actually died in the Second Crusade. Most casualties were Christian crusaders, and even then the death toll was quite low comparatively. Anywhere from 40,000 to 60,000 soldiers are killed, and while the death toll for the civilians is unknown, it is estimated to be around the same. While not particularly violent, it was seen as a crushing defeat for the Christians because of how easily dispatched the Crusaders were. This leads us into the Third Crusade. In the interim period between the Crusades, Saladin, arguably the wisest and most intelligent Muslim general ever, renews the Islamic reconquest efforts. Saladin wipes out Jerusalem's army at the Horns of Hattin and continues forward, cleaning out nearly the entire kingdom of Jerusalem. He conquers the eponymous capital city on October 2nd in 1187. Tyre is the only city that actually clings to life. This defiance causes Western Christianity to launch the Third Crusade to take Jerusalem back. Enter King Richard the Lionheart, who heads up the Christian efforts. The Byzantines are initially neutral, perhaps even against Westerners, attempting to impede travel to the Holy Land. However, upon seeing success, the Eastern Christians support the crusade against Saladin's forces. The Third Crusade was largely successful early on, and was far more diplomatic than the other crusades. Many lands were sold and bartered between Richard and the Knights Templars, as well as Richard and Saladin. Richard's strategy was simple: control the coastline in order to have easy supply movement. He succeeds in capturing Sicily as a stopping point between England and Asia Minor. He presses on and takes Cyprus, fully cementing the supply line. From there, Richard makes aggressive and successful expansions. All of Europe sees this and follows suit, meeting up for the siege of Acre. Acre had been under siege by the king of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan. However, Saladin sent forces to defend Acre, meaning Guy had not made very much progress. Richard and his English army, the French under Philip II, and the German army, whose king had previously died, all arrive at Acre and join in the siege. Richard pays those inside the city to weaken the defenses, just as was done in Antioch in the First Crusade, and this leads to the same result. Acre is sacked on July 12, 1191. This was a massive victory for the Crusaders, leading to renewed morale. Their next target was Jaffa. Up to this point, Saladin had been doing sort of guerrilla-style tactics, but he realized that this strategy of light ambushes was simply not working. So he decides to just confront the Crusaders in open warfare with his full army on the plains of Arsuf. Despite the massive clash, relatively few losses were sustained by both sides, and this was primarily due to the Crusaders' strategy. Taking a page out of the book from the French battles versus the Muslims over 400 years ago, the Crusaders hugged the coastline to ensure one direction to defend against, and form a strong wall around heavy cavalry, which, as we discussed, is basically like putting barricades in front of your tanks. Muslims advance against the wall but are unable to break through, at which point the heavy cavalry is released and respond and just decimates the Muslims swiftly. Saladin realizes he cannot win here with the current positioning and retreats before extensive losses are suffered. Richard presses on and captures Jaffa with relative ease. He advocates for moving deeper south and cutting off Egypt from Saladin, which would remove the strategic base for the Muslims. However, Richard is overruled and the Crusaders head to Jerusalem to complete the crusade. This was ultimately a very bad decision. The Crusaders do successfully reach Jerusalem, However, Richard and his commanders agree that while they may be able to take the city, they most certainly cannot hold it, given that Saladin's army remains intact, and he would just launch a devastating counterattack. While they discuss this, Saladin strategically attacks Jaffa to divide the Crusader forces, ensuring Jerusalem's safety. Richard indeed takes a small contingent to Jaffa and actually surprisingly wins back Jaffa. The decision is made that Jerusalem cannot be taken, and stalemate is reached as neither side can make any progress. Richard has to turn back to England to protect his throne, marking the end of the Third Crusade. While in England, he reaches out to Saladin and negotiates. Crusaders relinquish control of several key fortresses in Asia Minor in exchange for safe passage of Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem and retaining control of Acre. Only about 25,000 people die in the Third Crusade. Richard makes a recommendation that in any future crusade, they ought to attack from Egypt, as that is considered the, quote, soft underbelly, unquote, of the Muslim Empire. Pope Innocent III agreed with Richard and announces the Fourth Crusade with the intent to attack Egypt. The Fourth Crusade, sadly, never actually touches Egypt. Byzantium plots against the Western Christians, leading to the crusade against fellow Christians to remove this proverbial thorn from the side. Derailment of the crusade first begins when Venetian merchants overpriced their ships drastically. They priced them at about 85,000 pieces of silver, which is twice what France as a country brings in a year at this point. The Crusaders strike a deal to reconquer the city of Zara that joined Hungary in exchange for cheaper ships. Innocent III is furious at this because Zara was a predominantly Christian city. He therefore excommunicates the Crusaders and the Venetians, but that excommunication is eventually lifted. However, the damage has been done and many Crusaders abandon the campaign. Attention then shifts from Jerusalem to Constantinople amidst the political game playing. Doge Enrico Dandolo advocates for attacking Constantinople. Alexios IV, who is the son of the current Byzantine emperor, saw Western help in taking the Byzantine throne for himself in exchange for supporting the West in future crusades. The Pope sanctions actions against Constantinople, and the Fourth Crusade officially abandons the Holy Land. The army, about 48,000 in number, is primarily made up of Venetians. Only 4,500 knights come on the crusade alongside 14,000 infantrymen and set out for siege. June 24th, 1203 marks the beginning of the siege. The ruler of Constantinople, Alexios III, flees the city on July 7th. Crusaders attempt to diplomatically install Alexios IV, but he is rejected by the Byzantines. His son, Alexios V, claims the throne and ardently opposes the Crusaders. Fun fact, he was nicknamed Mortzeflos because he had exceptionally bushy eyebrows. That has nothing to do with anything other than I just kind of found that funny. He goes on to execute his grandfather and father, Alexios III and IV respectively, to cement his rule in January 1204. The initial attack of the Crusaders on April 9th was repelled, but April 12th was catastrophic for Constantinople. The city is crushed entirely and particularly violently. The Venetians, in complete disregard of the church, whom excommunicated them, go in and rape, pillage, and murder without mercy. Alexios V, for his part, flees to Thrace. The assault inside the city walls lasts for 3 whole grueling days. After all is said and done, Baldwin is established as the first Latin emperor of Constantinople, ruling over 5/8 of the city and 1/4 of the Byzantine Empire. This was not the only thing that the Fourth Crusade did, however. There was a brief crusade into the Holy Land over the summer of 1203, and it was surprisingly successful given that it was only 300 knights led by Renard II. Despite a plague wiping out about half of the Crusaders, they managed to reinforce the remaining Crusader states, and the Muslim head of Damascus was unwilling to engage in combat with them, so he just ceded Nazareth and Jaffa to their control. The Fourth Crusade ended up with about 100,000 dead and was by far the most violent. However, it was far more political than religious in nature. Yet Innocent III was not done, and aimed for Egypt again. Unfortunately for him, he died in 1216 the year before the Fifth Crusade began. With an army of about 30,000, they set sail primarily from Germany, reaching Egypt by May of 1218, just outside the city of Damietta. From the moment that the Crusaders set foot on sand, the leadership was unclear and indecisive. Damietta, for its part, had a very odd yet weirdly effective defense. Damietta had 3 layers of circular walls surrounding it, with a moat between the first and the second wall, which actually was not that uncommon, but a little weird. What's really weird, though, is that the harbor access to the city was blocked by a literal giant chain attached to a tower on an island and a bridge made of ships to resupply said tower. Weirder still is the way that the Crusaders got around this. They created a siege engine by sticking 2 ships together and pushed that to the tower. They were successful and conquered the island to begin a proper siege of Damietta. The siege lasts throughout the winter, spring, and summer of 1219 and is by far the longest siege in the Crusades. The siege lasted so long that starvation became a reality for both sides. The Muslim leader, Al-Kamil, offers an absolutely wild treaty where the Muslims would keep Damietta but give up Jerusalem to the Christians. However, the Christians understand that this is kind of a sneaky one. They reject the deal, knowing that they wouldn't be able to keep Jerusalem and would open themselves up from being attacked from all sides, meaning they would just get crushed instantly as soon as they accepted. Al-Kamil then, in response, orders an attack against the Crusaders, which fails miserably. This failure inspires the Crusaders to counterattack, and in November 1219, Damietta is successfully captured, with Al-Kamil fleeing. The Crusaders are actually horrified by what they find within the city limits. Bodies lay in the street, dead from starvation and disease, and the living don't look much better. The Crusaders, for their part, were actually not much better off, as scurvy had ravaged them and there was very little food. Debate and lack of supplies, including troops, kept the crusade paralyzed for a year and a half. Movement finally begins again in 1221, but is slow. Al-Kamil uses the Crusaders' slowness to his advantage and refortifies the defenses near Cairo. There is a significant and defining battle at Mansoura, and it is a crushing defeat for the Crusaders in July of 1221. Fifth Crusade ends with the Christians leaving and the Muslims gaining everything back that they had just lost. The death toll of the Fifth Crusade ranges from 50,000 to 100,000, depending on whom you ask. Finally, we reach the remaining Crusades. The 6th, 7th, and 8th Crusades were remarkably unremarkable. There were minor gains in the Levant, the Holy Land, and Syria. But once the 8th Crusade had concluded, support for Crusades in Western Christendom collapsed. Muslims seized upon this and drove Christians out of the Holy Land entirely. Crusades conclude as successful in their duration in terms of preservation and liberation, but failure in the ultimate goal of capturing and retaining Jerusalem. So let's discuss the overall casualties. By the most liberal estimate possible, not taking bias into account, 9 million people died in the Crusades, which would make it the 13th most deadly conflict in history. Now, again, these are the most possible liberal estimates, including some really out there ones. And you have to count all 8 wars as one, something that is not done for other wars. Violence actually in itself accounts for a minority of the death, as it was primarily disease and starvation that were the killers. In terms of the wars of history, the Crusades are far and away not exceptionally violent. In fact, the opposite is true. So why are the Crusades significant? They are significant because of the narrative that has been constructed around them. We have all been told or all heard once in our lives that Christians were evil and violent for the Crusades. Certainly, lots of corruption happened in the later Crusades. The Crusades initially were launched to free Christians from Muslim oppression. Crusades were not remarkably violent, however, in terms of actual war. So why have these false narratives been spread? They've been spread because the narrative is indicative of the Crusades themselves. It is about Western Christianity versus non-Western, non-Christian values. The goal of the narrative is to undermine Christianity, Christendom, and everything that has come from it. The Crusades were not only immoral, they were fully justifiable, and given their initial goal, were completely morally right. Do not let enemies of Christianity tell you about Christianity. That is a recipe for disaster. If you guys have enjoyed this different presentation, please let us know in the comments below. While you're down there, feel free to hit the like and subscribe button. And Deus Vult, we will see you in the next one.